So here we go. It's 2 o'clock in Finland in the afternoon. Welcome everyone really warmly to Erno Lehtinen Online Colloquium, the second event of the history of the mankind. And we are very happy to have Roger Säljö here with us. I'm going to first tell you something about the schedule and how this will work. So we have adjusted a little bit of this since last time, and so the schedule is such that I'm going to open this event. It happened already, by the way, nearly totally, and I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker, and he will give us about 45-minute presentation, and then Erno and Roger will discuss about the topic of the presentation, and at this point we will ask a special favor from those of you who wish not to actually participate in the small group discussions. It would be very helpful for us if you could stop the session and let the people who want to discuss in small groups to have the discussions, because the Zoom does the breakout room activities so that in spite of if you're actually going to come into the break room, it will put us all into the rooms, and then there might be very empty rooms as it happened last time. So then in the breakout rooms, we have a special discussion topic that Roger has prepared for us, and then Jake will close the session. So that's the plan. But why did we want to have Roger's presentation and stimulation this time? We have other ones coming up. This is a tiny little advertisement. We are going to talk a little bit more about those in the end. Lieven Verschaffer, Lieven's recorded session is on the web pages, and it's freely in your use if you want. And this session is going to be, and it's actually recorded as well, and we will be editing it so that it's nice and video. So Roger will talk to us about hybrid minds and sources of knowing, the socio-material nature of human cognition. And this is the reason why we are having Roger to speak in this ELOC session. I think what he has been writing in Educational Psychologist a little over 10 years ago is kind of a spirit of these ELOC events as well. So he's been writing that in the spirit of our business learning research, we should learn about traditions that are available, inquire into basic assumptions, ontologies, and epistemologies, and increase our sensitivity to what extent and in what sense they are compatible. And we should help each other realize what the differences in assumptions and units of analysis are, as they may be hard to see from inside any one of them. But there should also be competition between perspectives. So if you think of the last time and this time, and then the next time, these approaches will be probably pretty different from each other. But the competition between perspectives, because there are so many contexts and practices where learning is a fruitful point of departure for analyzing what individuals and collectives engage in. And he welcomes rivalry and coexistence should lead us forward. So this is the kind of the so beautifully put words that I thought that this is actually what we aim with the ELOC events as well. So there's a tradition to introduce all our speakers in numbers and in words. And I had a look at Scopus, and these numbers are big numbers for many of us and all of us. Like, he's been very, very much cited. He has a huge number of articles. He has nearly 100 co-authors. And he's even an honorary doctor of the University of Turku and other 2 universities. So in numbers, he's really a senior and admired person in our our learning research area. I would like to describe him as in words as well. You can see there the northern lights from Kiruna, northern Sweden, where he comes from originally. And clearly, I think he's an expert, and he has been also doing very remarkable novel research on expertise, development of visual perception in experts in different domains. In his theories, I think he is remarkably logical, and in his communication with and in his conversations, he is absolutely lovely. Like, even though like you might disagree with him, it's always such a pleasant event to talk with him. He's outstanding scholar, and it is really an honor to get him participate in this celebration of Erno. And he's convincing. I have a reference, and I'm going to use a citation from a famous educational researcher, Erno Lehtinen. So Erno has said that if a hardcore cognitivist cannot get a grasp on sociocultural theories of learning and why they are needed, she needs to talk with Roger, and then she understands. So welcome, dearly, Roger. We are really looking forward to your presentation and the discussions with Erno later.
Thank you very much, Minna. I hope I can live up to part of these very wonderful words. Let me first upload my presentation so that we can can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, good. And I will yes. First of all, thank you very much, Minna, for those kind words, and I'm very much enjoying being part of this celebration of Erno and his achievements. And I've been happy enough to collaborate with Erno for many, many years. I tried to remember the first time we met, but I failed. But we knew each other well ahead of Erno being in Turku. I remember he was in Joensuu and other places when we first met, I think. And I've taken the opportunity to sort of reflect on the changes that have happened in research in educational psychology, broadly speaking, while we've been engaged and actively contributing and participating in trying to develop the field. So this is sort of the underpinning of much of my talk. And one of the things that I appreciate with Erno is his breadth in understanding different theoretical traditions and their contributions. We have run many courses, PhD courses and similar things together, and I'm always very sort of impressed, as I said, by the way in which Erno manages to grasp different traditions and their assumptions. So I think this is something interesting, and as in the quote that Minna showed us, I think this sort of discussion both within and between traditions is very important. So I will give my presentation, and the title is Hybrid Mind and Sources of Knowing, the Socio-material Nature of Human Cognition. And I take it to be sort of an attempt to reflect on the roots and aspirations of educational psychology to be a socially relevant field of research, and our interests in development and learning and all the specializations that go within these fields should have something to bring to contemporary society and to the issues that we discuss. And so why educational psychology has a reasonably long tradition. We can at least trace it back to the work of Thorndike, beginning of the 20th century, but we can also, if we are more generous, trace it back to the experimental psychology, the beginning of experimental psychology in Germany in the latter half of the 20th century, and also in the US, where there were labs setting up, studying issues that have to do with learning, remembering, conceptual understanding, and so on. So we have this long tradition, and at the same time, we are now in a situation during the past 50 years, or maybe since the Second World War, which has been dramatic in terms of social development, in terms of participation in education, and in terms of the kinds of issues which have become relevant for us. And some of the issues that fascinate me are, first of all, there's an incredible growth of knowledge and information. This is almost unbelievable, and so this means that the issue of how we reproduce knowledge and skills through education, but also outside education, is very much at the focus of our attention. So, for instance, schools or schooling cannot keep up with these dramatic developments. There are all kinds of selective strategies applied, where, for instance, the curricula are become overcrowded, so they take out, try to cope with this by taking out specific elements. But this always leaves the sense among some people that we're losing something important. But I take this growth of knowledge and information to be one of the very dramatic events that have happened in the post-war period. In response to this is the other side of the coin. There is an increasing specialization of knowledge and skills. I think if you go into big companies, or indeed in a university, you see this very easily. People, or very obviously, people sitting next to each other, in some sense doing similar work, but on the other hand, living in very different conceptual, methodological, and intellectual domains. So the specialization of knowledge and skill is a response to this growth of knowledge and skills. When knowledge and skill grow, we have to specialize, and there are obvious risks between this. For instance, our subfield becomes divided into sorry, I have to just postpone this. Was an update coming in. There is an increasing specialization in response to these developments, and the risk with this specialization is that we get many subfields which are unclear in terms of their linkages to each other. So we can study, for instance, many kinds of motivation, many kinds of learning, and so on. And it's not entirely clear how these can be coordinated and bring us a more comprehensive picture. Of course, also the issues having to do with digitization and the transformation from analog types of instruments for teaching and learning to digitized versions is a very big transformation, which gives us new modes of accessing information, analyzing it, presenting it, structuring it, and so on, and also gives us opportunity to share information and knowledge in new ways. So I take these to be social changes, broad changes that have an impact, and that we have to live up to, or provide some sorts of suggestions of how we cope with these changes. And one of the issues which fascinates me, and that is what Minna referred to in her introduction, is this idea of units of analysis. That a unit of analysis represents some kinds of assumptions that people have. It's a unit through which various processes are accessed and described and analyzed. So, for instance, we have a lot of research on cognitive processes that are held to be located in the human mind: concepts, procedures, memory systems, remembering, and so on. That's one line of research, which is very big. We have research grounded in the neuroscience area and interest in brain processes, localization of various kinds of activities, the interaction between various parts of our brains. We have research on interactional processes in classrooms, on the internet, knowledge sharing, argumentation, and so on. We have an interest in meaning making, in problem solving.
Genau, ich habe da eine schöne.
And it's sorry, someone intervened. Auf Deutsch. And we have an interest in issues of meaning making and how people appropriate knowledge and solve problems and engage in different knowledge areas. Again, there are Erno is one of the few people who have has some sort of grip over these various areas, but there is a problem in making these different fields speaking to each other. These different units of analysis sort of throw people into very different kinds of research, and when we then try to retranslate the research problems into some sort of coherent theory or coherent advice, it's often difficult because the messages are very mixed. And Arno and I have been involved in various kinds of concrete work, and this is an illustration of what I'm going to say. This is a virtual lab that we worked with for many years together with Stanford, and was also a project in Finland on this. And the point here that I want to say is that we have these new media then, and they have different affordances to the traditional media, which impact our ways of understanding and our ways of reasoning. So for instance, in this case, you can very easily learn about something which is very abstract. You can learn about acidification of the ocean. And the point I want to make is through this very elaborate design, you can sort of understand a problem from the top down. You can understand the nature of ocean acidification, and you can experiment and transform without having this long training that you would need to have in order to be a marine scientist or an oceanographer or something like that. So you're kind of thrown into a situation where you learn from the top down. You engage with these tools and can understand the general issue and trace the issues way into the traditional disciplinary areas and concepts and so on. The other thing is a similar remark on this virtual microscope that we've done extensive work with, and several of you have been involved in this. And it's again the same reflection that these resources support and help us to reflect and interact in a very dynamic fashion with in this case tissue samples or images of tissue samples, where we can dynamically relate to them. We can test hypotheses. We can generate a lot of knowledge that we didn't bring into the situation. It's not just a copy of something. It's something that you dynamically interact with, and you tease out what is interesting for you, and you can, in this sense, you can develop your knowledge and understanding in an interactive and dynamic fashion. And this one is part of a so-called carbon footprint calculator, which we have been using with students at the ages of 14 and 15. And it's amazing how quickly, given this interface, which they are familiar with, that they can understand the concept of carbon footprint. That is, that all human activities, all human sort of engagements with the world produce a carbon footprint, and they can engage in, without a very long introduction, some introduction is necessary, but they can engage with and understand the consequences of whether you drive an electric car or a car using petrol, or any such kind of comparison, eating meat and not eating meat and so on. So they can engage with issues which in principle are very abstract and beyond the capabilities of understanding for most of us. So this is an interest in the affordances of these tools and what the sort of implications, both in curricular terms, but also in terms of personal understanding, are of the introduction of these tools. But let me make one step back, and to me, learning is a form of life. It's a way of living, and it's not necessarily something that is regulated or controlled. So all forms of social life from the very beginning of time until now rely on knowledge. The differences are in the nature of knowledge that we have access to. So all societies have a need to reproduce knowledge, skills, values, and identities of its members and communities. That is, they have to maintain and develop what the evolutionary psychologist Merlin Donald calls their cultural memory. That is the source of or resource of knowledge that we can fall back on when we need it, and has accumulated over many years, over a long time. And I want to see the role that socio-material tools play in helping us to both reproduce but also to develop this social memory, and to see knowing and thinking as something that interacts with these the knowledge that has accumulated over the years. So I would argue that what we see now is a changing nature of many cognitive functions, such as perception, remembering. This is not a new, it has happened for a long time, as I will try to persuade you, but it's appearing in new manners now, owing to some of the affordances of recent inventions. And so, for instance, if you take the activity of remembering, the human activity of remembering, for a very long time, 3,000 or 4,000 years, or if you take more advanced forms, maybe 2,500 years, they have been supported by a technique that we know as texts or two-dimensional representations of experiences that may either be images or texts of some kind, or there are lots of ways of codifying experiences, but the limited nature of the human capacity to remember has been sort of sidestepped, or is no longer limiting our capacities to build up a cultural memory of enormous proportions, because we outsource our experiences and put them in maps and texts and other kinds of artifacts. And what happens then is that we interact with these tools when we remember. We do not stand alone. And if you look through culture, there are many such tools of remembering. In fact, they're all around us. They remind us of many things, and we, in many cases, we immediately understand what they mean. So, for instance, that you're not allowed to cross the street is obvious to many of us that share this similar cultural experiences. In other cases, such as with the texts, you can take the rune stone on the upper right. There's a need for a transformation of the human mind in order to be able to rely on such sources. That is, there's some form of education which is necessary in order for people to adapt to the particular ways of representing past events that is produced. And in the upper right corner, you see a chemical formula which has the similar function of being a resource for remembering and a resource for communicating. And of course, when the systems get very complicated, as in some of these written formats, we have to have very extensive training in order to be able to profit from this. But once we achieve that level, we can use these external resources to compensate for our own limited capacities. And you can take one field after the other, and you can see that there are these kinds of tools that help us. We can gaze at the stars through particular kinds of optical resources. We can use other kinds. We can use night vision, which is the lower light, infrared light to see at night. And we can use microscopes to observe things which are beyond human perception. And of course, we can also use various kinds of medical techniques for watching or analyzing the human body. And I took this example purpose because Erno and I, together with some of you, who are present went through this experience of trying to discover the plural white line during a session with a medical specialist or a couple of medical specialists. And the interesting thing, which is, again come back to, is that the ability to see the plural line is dependent on technologies. And if you're a novice, you cannot see it. But within, I think it was about 3 or 4 hours, I can't remember exactly, at the hospital in Turku, we learned to see this plural white line, I think all of us, and I think we performed almost to perfection. And it was a kind of shift in figure ground when you look at an image and you realize that that there is something there which was not obviously visible to you, but you had to have the support of an informed person to see it. But once you achieved that, it was difficult not to see it because it stood out as obvious. And this shift in perspective illustrates one of my main points, that we are shaped by our attention and our capacity to analyze the world. They are shaped by all these artifacts that mediate the world for us. And the problem here in relation to the tradition of psychological research is that when psychological and educational research, broadly conceived, went into the laboratory, these resources were taken away from us. So remembering was studied as something that is inherent to the mind. And of course, then we are very limited, highly limited as people have studied. And we are portrayed as if we forget very quickly. This famous retention curve or forgetting curve usually depicts a situation where the initial phases show dramatic drops, as is the case here, and then something stays on in our memories. In other cases, I mean, in the case with this plural line, it's once you have seen that, you may get rusty, but it's very easy to recover. It doesn't really go away from you. It's part of your repertoire of visual knowledge of visual representation. So this was a step where all of these external resources for remembering and perception and so on were sort of taken away, and something else was studied, which was the person in isolation, devoid of any reference or any ability to relate to what we normally relate to. And this is the left kind of image where thinking was described as essential as an activity bounded by the skull of the individual, and an inward activity. That is something that happens when you turn inwards. I'm not saying that we don't do that when we think, we certainly do, but in most cases our thinking, our cognition is directed outwards. It's involved in engagement with other people and with various kinds of external tools, what I call symbolic technologies. We talk to each other, we encounter, or sort of we have dialogues or multilogues and analyze things, or we nowadays have instruments of various kinds in the flow of our activities. We are not left to ourselves. If there's something we don't remember, we don't have to sit and think. We can turn outwards. And the background of this is, I think we live in a world that is designed. This is we design our physical reality, but we also design our cognitive and intellectual world. They mediate the world for us in particular ways, and we become attuned to those ways of operating through instruments, and that is how we are shaped as thinking individuals. So I think there's an analog between how we transform the physical world through technologies, and how we transform our intellectual repertoires through engagement with technical devices or devices where we have managed to embed symbolic information that we can process and manipulate. So in my view then, thinking, reasoning, learning, and all these kinds of activities rely on detours. And collaborations with signs and artifacts. And sign is a kind of artifact. The alphabet is a sound, but it's an artifact. But artifacts can also be physical. And this is what I then call a hybrid mind. And a hybrid mind does not operate on its own. It's critically dependent on support from external tools. Its power lies in its capacity to engage with information outside itself. And this, again, is not a new development. This is a development that has been going on for almost any area. You can see that there are sort of there's an evolution of tools for solving particular kinds of problems. So on the upper left hand there you see a multiplication table from Mesopotamia, and the lower right you see the Tiananmen spire from which is now used in schools heavily. And there are hundreds or even thousands of intermediate steps here where sort of increasingly sophisticated functions have been built into such devices. And what a person can do if he or she is trained with Tiananmen spire is way above what he and she can do without it, in terms of calculating, but also in terms of remembering, displaying information, communicating information, and so on. But something that also fascinates me is this compensatory character of socio-materiality. I think, here I'm not just thinking of people who are handicapped, or I'm thinking of all of us, that we have a compensatory sort of, the text helps us remember. It's compensatory for us. The search engine helps us to search information which we have no possibilities of covering. So we're all sort of rely on these compensatory features of socio-material devices. And here you see various such, the hand alphabet on the right, you see the Braille alphabet for writing, for tactile communication. On the lower right hand side you see the spectacles, one of the really great inventions in the history of mankind. Without that, many of us would be very, very handicapped, including myself. And it's a medieval invention in the 13th century. And on the lower left hand, you see a tool invented to communicate with people who are deaf and blind. So it's a tactile sort of communication system. And this again illustrates my point that when we develop, we invent resources that take us beyond what we currently are. So they add to our capacities to communicate, to remember, to manipulate information, and so on. And this is a restless process. I bet you this will never stop. This goes on forever. And so symbolic technologies, then, they have a material existence. They are not abstract. They rely on inscriptions and documentary practices. And these inscriptions and documentary practices may be complex and may be abstract and so on, but they are also material, and then they're visible. You can see them or touch them, depending on what system it is. And in order for us to use these resources, then we have to be members of interpretive communities and be familiar with interpretive practices. So if you're going to read, you have to be familiar with the alphabet. If you're going to compose a piece of music, you have to be familiar with the writing system of music, or you have to have a tape recorder present when you compose your music, and so on. So it's this parallel development between sort of socio-material resources for using in cognitive practices and the shaping of interpretive practices and interpretive communities. And and now I have a second point here. My point then is that these symbolic technologies, they shape societies, but they also shape our minds, or if you want to, they shape how we think. I'm not thinking of the mind as a stable entity, but our practices of thinking. And I took two quotes here to make this concrete. It's this duality of text and literacy practices. So here I have my good friend David Barton and Mary Hamilton. They write Writing, for instance, is both an internal psychological process of committing thoughts and ideas to a visuographic form, and at the same time, writing is out there. It exists along with other social artifacts of culture and forms part of a broader social context. So writing is part of many social practices like courts of law, business practices, schools, and so on. So it's a part of both our interior and our exterior. And the very famous British anthropologist Jack Goody made the same point when he said that systems of communication are clearly related to what man, always men in this context, can make of his world, both internally in terms of thought and externally in terms of his social and cultural organization. So there's not a divide between this, but it's what our patterns of thinking, our capacities to accumulate knowledge and so on have, and the devices we invent also have consequences for the way in which society is organized, for our professions, for our schools, for our universities, hospitals, and so on. And these consequences on our ways of the psychological level have been documented in many contexts. And in relation to literacy, there are some famous examples that, for instance, even though the final set of statements here in these sort of riddles or games, we have all men have 4 legs, Alex is a man. All of us would agree that Alex has 4 legs because we are just looking at a text-based reality. We are not asking questions about what the world really is like. So even if this contradicts our experiences, we accept this is part of a text-based reality. It's logical, as we've said. The third statement follows from the first 2 ones, even if they're empirically wrong. And as Luria showed in his studies of people who had not been exposed to literacy or texts, this is a very abstract form of reasoning. It's entirely related to a lengthy experience of engaging with text. So here's one of his famous examples. Cotton can grow only where it's hot and dry. In England, it's cold and damp. Can cotton grow there? I don't know, says this farmer. Think about it, says the interviewer. I've only been in Kashgar country, this country. I don't know beyond that. But on the basis of what I said to you, can cotton grow there? And then he says, if the land is good, cotton will grow there. But if it's damp and poor, it won't grow. So the farmer here engages with the land and whether cotton can grow under one or under some specific conditions or not, while the interviewer is engaged in a text-based practice. Which is logical even if it's empirically, even if you don't know, you've never been there, or even if you don't know what the empirical truth is, it's still true. It's logical because this is a text-based game. So the notion of a hybrid mind is that it operates in symbiosis with material and symbolic tools of the cultural memory, which in sometimes were developed over millennia. And we rely on productive mergers and coalitions, as Andy Clark puts it, with such symbolic artifacts. And there's no sharp line of division between minds and reasoning and artifacts. Thinking are emergent. So for instance, when Erno and I learned to, and some of you learned to see the plural line, it's very difficult to say that this happens in the mind or in the artifacts because they're present together. And that is what brings about this particular change, this sort of emergent process of seeing something in a different way. And then a very interesting aspect for me is that we live in a world that is designed. So we relate almost everything. Nothing is as natural to humans as technology. And almost everything we engage with is designed and sort of affords different perspectives, leads us in certain directions. And for research and theorizing, I come back to this issue I raised. The problem is the unit of analysis. What I can do if I have a microscope or a computer is very different from what I can do and understand if I don't have such tools available. So I think it's legitimate to ask questions about what these recent symbolic technologies that follow suit in the form from digitization imply for how we know what we know and how we learn, assuming that we are cognitive hybrids. And it's clear, as I tried to illustrate with these examples of virtual learning environments, that we interact very differently with those compared to how we interact with classical texts or more analog representations. So the concept of hybrid mind, the problem here is that it's not, the term learning becomes a bit limited, because with such tools we engage in a range of epistemic practices. We look things up, we search for them, we try to digest them, and so on. It's not just the taking in of something which is already fixed and already clear always. We have to sort of engage in something, searching on the internet or using a search engine or in order to arrive at what we are interested in. Of course, this is not entirely different from what the world was before. We could look up in dictionaries and so on. But the one significant difference is then how these tools of recent time are integrated into the flow of our activities. The fact that if you look at what people engage in, you will find that in almost every step there's some such resource that they rely on and that they relate to. And I'm particularly fascinated by what has happened during the past 10 years with children, young children, even toddlers, even children before the age of 1, where you can see that they now come to preschool or to school at the age of 6 or 7 with sometimes 4 or 5 years of experience of interacting with particular kinds of symbolic technologies. And here the one very consequential invention was the introduction of the tablet, and after that the smartphone, which gave even young children access to large parts of our cultural memory, because they could circumvent the need of reading and writing. They could circumvent much of this written technologies that are often block access to the cultural memory. If you can't read, there are lots of things you cannot do. But this was the touch screen and the app, and this gave even very young children access to this. And I won't go into this, but we've seen a rapid development. The tablet is only 10 years of age. There were tablets before, but the breakthrough is only 10 years of age. And if you ask a child at the age of 8 or 9 today that there was actually a time when there were no tablets or smartphones around, they don't believe you, because they are so attuned to these instruments. They are so adapted to them. And I looked at some of the figures of how benchmarking of internet use, and you can see here a dramatic development. In the year 2000, the average age for engaging with the internet was 14 years of age in Sweden. And then you see it drops to 9 years, and it drops to 3 years, then it drops to 2 years. And in the most recent figures, this is actually 2017, I now have the 2019 figures. There is about 85% of the 2-year-olds are on the internet on their own, and about 50% of the 1-year-olds, that is between 0 and 1-year-old, watch film clips and movies, and they do that on their own. And the interesting thing is that it's not directly always under parental control or parental supervision, because it's very difficult to handle this. So we see here an adaptation to a particular kind of epistemic practices. When you're exposed to this over a long time, you learn things about where to look, what to look for, where to turn, and so on. And there are also transformations of cognitive habits and learning trajectories. You kind of learn in completely different ways. A lot of children learn to write at home today, but they use the keyboard, and they learn to identify letters and so on as part of an activity they are engaged in, not by immediately focusing on the alphabet or letters. And they learn to remember, and they learn to communicate in this way. And what I think is also very interesting for us is that this development has meant that schools have lost control over how many elements of the cultural memory are reproduced, because it's reproduced outside the formal educational system through media experiences broadly conceived. And so how does a hybrid mind develop? If we look at the traditional perspectives of Piaget and even Vygotsky and so on, there is a notion of development which is somehow connected to the individual. In the Piagetian version, it's kind of an embryonic metaphor where you are an embryo and you develop in specific steps and so on. But a hybrid mind does not develop in that way. It develops by being interconnected with symbolic technologies. When you learn new symbolic technologies, you also change your behaviors, you change your activities. And we engaged in communities, and an increasing number of these are virtual. They don't have to be our family. We don't even have to know them. They may external. And we engage in practices early on, gaming and so on, and we learn not through mere instruction. And we co-construct knowledge with others. We are socialized into cultures of collaboration to a large extent. And this is sort of this is how a hybrid mind is nourished in its development. It's not an internal process of something that was with you as an embryo and is developing in a predetermined pattern, but it's extremely sensitive to the external engagement and the availability of symbolic technologies. So to finish, and this is this is not clear at all, but in this new environment, we often master complex tasks without understanding the sequential steps. We can use many technologies without understanding how they operate. So technologies function as a black box, and it's no longer possible for education to unpack a white box, all that is embedded in symbolic technologies. If we do that, we end up in an infinite regression of trying to explain things which are not at the focus of attention of people. I remember the first time that computers were on the in the curriculum in Sweden, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, and the first textbooks, they explained how the computer operated, with a hard disk and the memories and so on the keyboard. But of course, that is not how a computer appears to a user, because many of these processes are black box, and we cannot engage with them. We rely on them at a functional level. And as I said, we increasingly learn from the complex to the elementary. We get exposed to complex activities, complex events, and so on, and we have to learn to unpack them in a way which is very different from how learning is organized traditionally. So we often understand initially as part of practices. We learn to operate in a practice, and we do not necessarily understand as part of hierarchically organized knowledge. That may come as a later step, but it's not this piecemeal understanding of small steps which brings us the complete understanding. We often start from a complex activity and work our way downwards in sort of ascent to the concrete, as some put it. But this is very obvious in these virtual environments that we have studied, I think. And does this mean that teaching, instruction, and schooling, misspelt, are not vital or not important? No, that's not the case at all. And it's very obvious not the case, because people have never been at school for so long as they are now. In many countries, you begin in preschool at the age of 2, and you don't finish your upper secondary school until 18 or 19, and about 50% or even more go on to higher education. So formal education, institutionalized education, is thriving and is growing, and is a very important part of this. And the needs for instruction, guidance, and so on increase because we have these developments of expansion of knowledge and so, and insights into epistemic practices, how to trust knowledge and how to find relevant information, how to combine it into something that is worth knowing, or these issues are still as important, maybe even more important than before, because a part of the consequence of the growth of knowledge is also that the world is becoming more abstract for us. We have access to many things that we do not understand. And learning should be more, this engaging and developing epistemic practices is more of a sense of becoming through choice and guidance in an increasingly diverse world. We cannot force this onto people. They have to collaborate. They have to engage in it. And what we count as knowledge still needs to be validated. So there has to be feedback systems available to people, which are not in these instruments themselves, which are not necessarily, no matter how sophisticated these this access to information and knowledge is, the validation of the knowledge is not in the same, is a different matter. That has to be brought in as a comparison to other sources and other relevant claims about how the world is organized. So we have a need with interaction with partners which are more capable than ourselves, even in under these circumstances. This is not a self-playing piano, these new resources. Okay, thank you very much. That was my presentation. I think I kept the time roughly well.
So, okay, thank you.
Could I take away my PowerPoint?
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so yeah. Thank you very much, Roger, for the very interesting presentation, which is also kind of intellectually challenging for us, and also challenge many of the, let's say, the conventional beliefs we have in educational traditions. And I would start with the very last ideas you have. Then later on, I go to the more general theoretical issues. But if you think about the role of formal education, teaching, classroom activities, schooling, in this modern situation, if you look at the historical meaning of education, of course, it has had many functions in society. Some of them have nothing to do with learning. Other functions educational systems have. But if you think it from the point of view of learning, one of the reasons why quite early on this formal educational system were developed was that there are many things which children and young people do not learn in just normal everyday practices. It's been one of the reasons why it's necessary to have the kind of formal educational situation where we systematically try to understand things in a way which we do not necessarily learn in everyday life. And now it's related to your very last points here. Is the huge development of technologies, and now the symbolic and I would call also cognitive technologies, changing this situation?
Well, I agree with your point that from the very beginning, institutionalized forms of learning were explicitly designed so as to make people encounter cognitive and communicative skills that they did not encounter in their everyday lives. The first schools were schools where you learned to read and write, for instance, and reading and writing was not available in society unless you joined a particular institution. And reading and writing rely on teaching. If you have very complex written systems with maybe hundreds of symbols and so on, you must have a teacher. There must be a person who sort of introduces you to this and who coaches you through it. So it is necessary, and I think that part is still relevant today. I mean, it's a curriculum is a document where a society takes some strategic decisions on what people should be exposed to in view of their future, in view of their role as citizens in view of qualifying themselves as individuals, but also for the labor market and so on. And many of these experiences you will not make unless you are in a curriculum regulated learning activity. And I think this is even more so. Well, it's definitely there now, and it has been for a long time. But it's also the fact that there are. There are now other sources. I took this example with reading and to some extent writing. It's an activity that used to be taught at school exclusively. And for instance, in Sweden, up until the 90s, around the turn of the millennium, preschool teachers were not allowed to teach reading and writing because it was said that children are not mature for it and so on. And then they make them, if they would have continued along those lines, they make themselves obsolete because a lot of the children learn that at home. They learn it through their parents, but they also learn it through engaging with such devices nowadays as they learn, for instance, how to identify letters because they need to achieve something in this. So the problem becomes that if you do not engage with that at a very early age, you have one group of children who are already very advanced, and you have other groups of children that have no access to this for various reasons. They don't regulate that. So I think this dilemma is very interesting nowadays. And now, of course, at least Swedish preschools, it's all about literacy and numeracy, and every story you tell has to have some educational point of view to it. So, but that's another problem. But I think institutional activities, these examples of how you learn to understand text-based realities, that is largely a result of institutional experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So one term you used was the black box idea. That when we start using new technologies, we do not understand what is going on, or we normally do not understand what is going on in that very technology, but we still can use them. And of course, when very young children start using, for example, tablets, it's clear that it's a huge black box, and then that there are some activities they can use. Of course, we can see, if you look at the history of education, that also within the formal education there have been similar black boxes, that when we introduce some terms, particularly in early phases of education, everybody understands that there are so many things behind that, that the children at that age are probably not able to understand it, but still this kind of more general concepts are helpful for them. But then if you think this general development now, do you think that there are also problems, that there are more and more things which we use and we are depending on, but we do not understand how they work?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think this is an interesting issue. In general, it's very difficult to make historical comparisons because we are adapted to the particular kind of societies we grow up with. We are sort of products of history and so on. But of course, there are. One of the features what I find interesting is that many things become abstract. So, for instance, what struck me, there are many conflicts between the big IT giants like Google and Microsoft and others, where they supposedly do different things. They register people, or there's this big fight now that the US government announced yesterday, I think, they sue Google for the fact that they, when you log on and you search for information, that the companies that advertise with Google somehow always end up at the top of what you search. So let's say you enter, I want to buy a computer. So the companies that have advertised with Google, they appear on the top. And I think most people do not have no clue about how this functions at a functional operational level. But of course they can, and because it's beyond, so the technologies through which this is arrived at, and the decision-making processes are beyond what we can grasp. But we can understand this at the conceptual level. We can understand that this is a problem, that the world operates in that way, and that sort of someone is regulating my access to the world, and I'm not aware of how that happens. And I can understand this conceptually, and I can react against it, and I can make inquiries, asking someone who is knowledgeable to explain to me what happens. But I cannot engage in this myself. It wouldn't, I mean, this is just one example. You could take hundreds of examples of similar kinds where I cannot go through all the steps and unpack them or white box them. And so we have to have a public discussion which is, focuses and helps us, sort of supports our understanding of processes of this kind. Well, that's just one example. I also think in terms of learning in science and so on, that many of the tools we use, if you are working in one field and using advanced computer systems, that you cannot account for the functionalities of the system. You trust that what you're seeing is there, and it's validated and so on, but you cannot explain why it appears there. You have to trust it, and you learn to trust it. But there's always the need to pay attention to these processes. And I mean, this you also had this in literacy. For instance, people writing things which were obviously incorrect or propaganda, or if you looked at newspapers during the fascist time in Europe, they were writing things which were completely way out and so on. And so there has been a similar situation, but it's through our ability to navigate in a much larger world, in a much bigger world of information and knowledge, this problem becomes has a different magnitude. And also with children, they often do this on their own.
Yes, and if we take this socio-material view to our thinking and learning, because it's as you have described, it has kind of expanded our opportunity to do things in a dramatical way, so that we have much more resources now available, and it's based on outsourcing, so that we outsource part of the cognitive processes to the external tools. Of course, that has gradually developed in the history of writing, number systems, so on. Now it's more and more technology where we outsource our thinking and cognitive processes. Also mean that then, let's say, commercial forces are more and more controlling our thinking and.
Yeah, I think it's. I would say that we are more and more dependent on the collaboration with such tools, and one of my favorite examples is bookkeeping. Or if you look at Excel, as the Excel systems, there's an enormous control of information that you can store there, and you can manipulate the information, you can change values, you can engage in what-if thinking. This is how it looks now, but what if this value would change? What would happen to this process? And so they're both sort of limitations or structures imposed on our thinking, but they also liberate our thinking, enable us to think differently, and to manipulate information, to speculate, to see what would happen if, and these kinds of hypothetical thinking, which I think is supported by many of these. I mean, the first tables in history are more than 5,000 years old, and the Excel is a version of that, but it's infinitely more powerful because, for instance, I can import data into it and operate with that data. I can manipulate them and so on. But there's always some kind of material practice at bottom. Somebody began to do this, and remnants or features of that material practice are still there. And we can see them, but we're not aware of that. We have no clue. Nobody thinks about that. This is somehow, some people call it alienation. We are alienated in front of much of this, but because we use them in contexts where they're familiar to us.
Yes, So yeah, this excellent example is very, very interesting because it makes it also possible to kind of experiment with things which wasn't so easy earlier. And I don't believe that within Excel there is a kind of hidden agenda with somebody. But if we are kind of outsourcing our thinking to Google, for example, then there are many kind of hidden agendas which are not visible for us, which is of course means that we are depending on things which we do not know what is what
it's not transparent to us what happens.
Yes, but then so if you take the developmental point of view, and that was impressive, the data you did show from Sweden, start using their own by their own digital tools and also connected to internet. Of course, that's happening in everywhere, and also games are part of that that kind of this material what children quite early on are using. There's a lot of critical discussion now, particularly also in Finland, and I think in other countries as well, that it also has some negative consequences for children's cognitive processes. For example, the problems of concentration and attention and so on. Do you think that these problems are becoming more and more serious if this development continues? Or do you believe at all to this problem?
Well, I think there are, it's not unreasonable. There are I mean, if you engage in gaming 20 hours per day at the age of 5 or 6 or 7, it's not. And if you continue doing that, it's not going to be positive. On the other hand, is there any causal explanation that we can make here? Is it maybe that there is some other problem that is involved in this in this situation? There was I talked to Sonja Livingston some time ago, and there was this very case of a girl committing suicide who was run through the British tabloids, and the particular game she engaged with were blamed. And it's a very difficult situation, of course, but it's not unreasonable that there were other problems involved in this situation. So yes, I think there are, when you have powerful social changes, there are always negative features of this. If you have a very powerful pharmaceutical, it will have side effects. and I've just been reading on the history of media, and very much the same problems that we now discuss with children were discussed with the radio at the beginning of the 20th century. Children were staying up late listening to mystery stories, and they came to school being tired, and after school was up they rushed back home to listen to the radio, and they did not engage with school. They preferred to listen to mystery stories, and some of them were morally objectionable, and all of these kinds of things. So it's a kind of repetition of arguments where you use the previous technology to discuss the present. But of course, this causes problem. And as I said, one of the problems is that we have this debate, and I think in all countries, as you say, but the interesting thing is if you look at how people behave, if you look at the newspapers, you get one image of all the horrors and the terrible thing. If you look at how parents of today, who are themselves products of digital societies, engage with their children, they are not reserved at all. Many of them would give if the child is crying, they would give her their mobile phone to watch a clip of a Disney clip or something like that, and they don't even understand when you sort of raise a question: is this really good? And so it's natural to use them in some situations, and my conclusion, we had one of my favorite stories is that we had up until 2015, when they measured the consumption of media in Sweden, and there are two big organizations doing this. They had a group of high consumers, as they call them, and those were people, teenagers and above, who used media, reported using media more than 3 hours a day. And there were a lot of discussions about this. And nowadays, it's the normal behavior. Every teenager uses internet more than 3 hours, but not every, but 90% or something. So, and my conclusion is this is that we are now leading digital lives. So it becomes more a philosophical question. Do we like this kind of society? Do we like to lead digital lives rather than inherent dangers of this? But and it's also, I mean, you log on and off so many times per day, so it's difficult to say how much you use the internet. We had all these discussions of screen time and also the radiation that was supposed to come out of the screens that were dangerous to us. And this is exactly what happened when television came as well. There were many American psychiatric society in the 1950s when television made 40s and 50s breakthrough in the US had exactly the same arguments. You're sitting there staring at something with lots of radiation and so on. So, and children become passive and so on. In that light, I mean, the comparison to traditional media here is that the users are much more active, much more engaged. We write more, we you know, more selective and so on. But I would guess that there are issues for some people who you know, overconsume or who alienate themselves from regular social life by doing this. But that does not mean that they wouldn't have had problems in a previous social formation.
Yes, it's in fact funny to see in some historical documents that there have been parents and educators worrying that many young people are reading too much. Too much time in reading.
Yeah, it was very objectionable in the 19th century, and especially among the farmers. The idea that girls would be reading was very objectionable, and also that young people were lying while reading. It was sort of, it went against the Protestant idea that you're out on the fields, you stand up and you work with your hands. I have this wonderful book by a priest who was very upset when he watched his parishioners lie and read.
Yes. So now Nina is giving us.
I'm giving you signs here.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. This has been like super wonderful to listen to your very kind of insightful discussion. But now it would be time for us to kind of jump into the breakout rooms. And now, as I kind of said in the beginning, that if someone now thinks like doesn't want to join the discussions in the breakout rooms, then please leave now before I share you there. Erno and Roger will be in some surprise rooms as well. So we will see who will be the lucky ones to get them in their rooms. But the recordings of the session will come on the ELOC web pages. So maybe in about a week or so. So then you can watch this and use this in your teaching, which I highly recommend. But let's go and discuss now about the topic that Roger has chosen for us. So the question is, what are the implications of the changes in learning and knowledge for our understanding of children's knowledge? It looks like I can see very many happy faces, so you clearly have had good discussions there. So now I'm going to give the floor to Jake, and would you like me to share something?
Yeah, can you share the slide? So yeah. I won't say too much now because I hope everyone is got their hybrid minds full of thoughts and interesting ideas and ready to go out into the world and you know, research, learning and teaching and all of these topics that are so important more. one thing that stuck with me kind of from the beginning that Roger pointed out was this idea about creating coherent theories, using these different units of analysis and coherent advice. I thought that was a really nice point as well, that we're also, trying to make practical, concrete impacts on the world as well in what we do. So, and that requires creating some sort of coherentness out of this research. And of course, then this ties back to the reason we have ELOC as we have it, stemming from, for instance, Roger and Erno's collaboration, but obviously Erno's collaboration across with many different people. And that's one reason why we really hope to see you back here next week or 2 weeks from now, to hear from maybe a different perspective, that of Elsbeth Stern, who will be talking about the role of intelligence and thinking about that. So definitely, even if maybe you come from a different perspective, hopefully you can also join there, and we can continue to create together something that could be somewhat coherent in the future someday, whether it be theory or practical applications. But yeah, just wanted to thank you again. Make sure you can, and you can check out all the information about the different speakers at the website. Yeah. Tack så mycket. Kiitos. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Roger, again.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Erna, from my part as well. And thank you, everyone who participated in I hope you had wonderful, lively discussions in the breakout room. It's amazing to have this event, and I warmly welcome to you to the next session as well. And so nice to see you, Roger, and everyone. Bye.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.